A healthy church flourishes with Christ's love. And here's been my aim all week as I've been meditating and working through this passage for my own soul, not just for you, but for my own soul. Here's been my aim, that we would see the text, we would savor what we see in the text, and then we would pursue it with unrelenting zeal. So my hope is that not only that this would be just a 40-minute exercise through 1 Corinthians chapter 13, but my hope is that this word would land on you and on me in a fresh way, that we would see what God is saying to his people, not only in the first century, but in the 21st century. And this is huge. It's imperative that we see this. And so let's look at chapter 13 in way of the very last statement of chapter 12, actually into the very first statement of chapter 14. And so let's notice what Paul writes. He says at the end of 12, "And I will show you still a more excellent way." And then, as you know, there would have been no break in the original. He begins in chapter 13, "If I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. If I give away all that I have, and if I deliver up my body to be burned, but have not love, I gain nothing. Love is patient and kind. Love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. As for prophecies, they will pass away. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will pass away. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part. But when the perfect comes, the partial will pass away. When I was a child, I spoke like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I gave up childish ways. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I have been fully known. So now faith, hope, and love abide, these three. But the greatest of these is love. Pursue love and earnestly desire the spiritual gifts, especially that you may prophesy." Who can preach such things? Who can preach such things? The first thing that, though, is important for us to, in our attempt to look at this, is that one of the most important things I think that you see at the very beginning of this passage, of which Paul is doing, is you have a church, keep in mind, that has lost their ways and traveled down paths and taken matters of some measure of secondary importance and elevated them above things of primary importance. And what Paul knows is that this church, even if you go back into chapters 1, 2, and 3, is that you have a church that has been sort of fanning the flame of pride among their own ranks. And so Paul knows that he has a people that when you have the issue of gifts that are being misused and misguided, and you have the predisposition to selfishness and pride, you have a formula, men and women, for a church that doesn't drift, it doesn't move into more and more healthiness, but remains unhealthy. And what Paul does is he's trying to, in verses 1 through 3 and then verses 8 through 13, is what he is trying to remind this local church of, is that love is superior in the life of the church. And this is important for us. How many of you know that it is easy for us to drift away even from our first love? We will see this even later in the message where Paul reminds us of the church at Ephesus. But I want you to note how he does this. I think this is important because what you have is you have people, again, who were elevating certain things to out of proportion, and they were missing the most important thing, that love, the love of Christ, is superior in the life of the church. Notice how he does this by using sort of hyperbole to emphasize his point. Notice what he says in verses 1 through 3. He says, "If I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal." So at the very beginning, one of the gifts that were being, in a large measure, being misused in the first century church, Paul, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, wants to put it where it should be and elevate what should be elevated always throughout the life of any church that flies the flag of Christ. That is love. It's interesting. What we note is that Paul uses, again, musical language to help us understand this emphasis, this superior emphasis. What you could note, or you could ascertain, is that the gift of tongues without love is terrible and deficient. Now, this is not a sermon on, as we talked about, the continuation of these issues or not. So if you're thinking about that, we could talk about that offline, or I could send you notes on where we walk through that. But what you need to see in the text is that what Paul highlights is that tongues without love is terrible and deficient. It offers a very troubling sound within the life of the body. I would add that any issue or any gift per se that's out of proportion and misused can add a very terrible sound within the life of the congregation. Now, how many of you love beautiful music? I'm not here to ask you what kind of genre you like. I'm sure if we were to go around the room, there would be different genres that you like, right? Some of you would be hip-hop, not many of you, but some of you would be hip-hop, right? Some of you would be more classical, some of you would be more contemporary, some of you would be sort of country western, some of you it may be, I don't know, pop. I have no idea, all right? I grew up on Milli Vanilli, you know that guy, right? Milli Vanilli. Yes. No, I didn't like it. I'm in trouble. That's not in the notes. But nonetheless, the point that I want to make is that that when you consider the wonder and the beauty of music, which is a gift of God and His grace, is that what Paul tries to do is he uses these terms. Notice what he says, the noisy gong and the clanging cymbal. And what Paul is trying to highlight for this church and for us as a church today is that when anything in the life of the body becomes misapplied, misproportioned, misused, we reduce the central aspect of genuine compassion and love, the depth of God's love among us, that we do not make beautiful music with one another, and I will add, to a community that needs Jesus. It's a horrific sound. Terrible. And I think even before we carry on with this, and Paul helps us, I think even in my own contemplation and trying to muse over this text this week, I think we are so deficient in our view of love because we have a distorted view of what Christ's love really is. It is so hard to even get to this text because, think about it. We can be loveless people, but we have to see that it's superior. He goes on to say, notice how he emphasizes it again, not only the issue of gifts, he moves in and says in verse 2, and if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith, notice this, if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. He stacks in multiple issues here, prophetic powers, insight, you could say, into the mind of God, and extraordinary faith, right? Extraordinary faith. Paul puts all of that and says, without love, what does he say? Without love, it makes me nothing. I am inconsequential. This is amazing. Now, many of you have grown up like me, particularly even in the West. We have been so programmed when we consider the gospel and faithfulness to always be looking for the heroic. Right? Think about it. We're always looking for the heroic, the spectacular. And what Paul does is he places all of these spectacular elements, prophetic powers, insight into the mind of God, extraordinary faith to even be able to remove mountains. And he says that without love, you're inconsequential. Wow. Right? You mean simple acts of compassion is what Paul's pressing for? It's superior in the life of the church. He goes on to say, again, he stacks another element. In verse 3, he says, he goes a little bit further. It's as if he's sort of just digging deeper, isn't it? Don't you love how he's a surgeon with precision? He just keeps going. In verse 3 he says, if I give away all I have, and if I deliver up my body to be burned, but have not love, I gain nothing. If I'm extravagant in my generosity, and I'm courageous for Christ, Paul is saying that apart from love, I still inherit nothing. That's amazing, isn't it? When you think about what Paul is emphasizing here. He goes to every length to heighten our need and our awareness of the centrality of love among God's people. That means, if you just think about that text for just a moment, that means that I or you could be an extremely generous person. You could give yourself to superior acts of devotion, and I think in right context of self-promotion, that you could inherit nothing. Make no mistake about it, love is never less than generosity, but love is always more than generosity. You know this. Paul goes to great lengths in verses 1, 2, and 3 to teach this young church and to teach Kingston that the gift of love among God's people is superior. And men and women, we today should resonate with the Apostle Paul. That the gift of love is superior. He elevates it above everything else. And let me just say this, that I believe that what Paul would say about any church is that love is the hallmark of God's people. It's the hallmark of God's people. And how far and how distant we live from this. We see in verse 8, another way that he highlights this superiority is, I think what you notice, he says love never ends. Just a clear statement. Sort of another element in his development is what we see that Paul does is that we still think that when you, as a couple of weeks ago, the eschatological view that Paul has on the things that he will list from verses 8 through verse 12, it's important for us to note that what Paul knows is that this issue of Christ's love among God's people is forever. I mean, just contemplate that for a minute. That we have been brought in by love, we continue, we grow in love, and we will carry on forever in love. What an amazing truth. And men and women, many of you know this. Just think missionally for just a moment. Let's think missionally for just a moment. There are people today who, when they consider Christians and they consider the church, love is not the first thing that they think about. And so I would just say that this has a very important missional impulse to truly love. Because here's the deal. Love never ends. And Paul is highlighting this. I'm struck at how profound this description is in light of our modern approach to Christian life today. Does this not strike you as odd in some measure? Because I think, honestly, sometimes we live so far from this picture, this superiority, right, of elevating it rightly. But it definitely strikes me as odd when you think about the modern approach to the Christian life today. And it should strike you odd. And so, in other words, we prefer, think about this, as I've thought long over this week. In other words, we prefer being loved rather than giving love. We are prone to offer a sentimental type of fluffy love that remains distant and cold instead of a grace-filled, personally intrusive love. We desire a love that costs us nothing. We're swallowed up and shriveling inside because of a pursuit of an erotic type of love that never yields what it promotes or promises. We love cliches, not concrete truth. We love comfort and convenience, not mission and impact. We love our sin, not killing our sin. We love the candy of heroic acts of devotion, not the meat of long-term quiet acts of deep compassion. When love leaves a church, men and women, or when love becomes twisted, she is in grave danger. Grave danger. So regardless of the extraordinary gifts at work within the life of the church, if love is not sustained and cultivated, men and women, we miss the mark. The love of Christ is superior. How many of you have grown up in the church maybe 20 years or more? And how many of you have heard a lot in your time within the life of the church, a lot of talk about the Great Commission? How many of you know the Great Commission is unwavering in its application to the church. It's timeless until Jesus returns. But I've said this before, and I think this is important for us to remember. The Great Commission will never be fully realized and practiced in your life and in my life apart from the Great Commandment. And I think that it's so sad today that we try to bypass the Great Commandment to get people on the Great Commission. And it does not work. It does not work. So please don't boast in the Great Commission apart from a passion for unrelenting pursuit of the Great Commandment. And don't miss that. This is so important. I'm reminded of Matthew chapter 22, verses 34 through 40. I would encourage you to go home and read it. That's where the Great Commandment is expressed multiple ways. But do you remember who he was addressing in that text when he first expressed the Great Commandment? Religious experts who loved their tradition. They had even added nuances to the law so that they wouldn't step across the law. And do you remember? They wanted to try to test him. Love the Lord your God, and then the end is love your neighbor. And what Jesus knows is what we need to know today is that apart from love, I don't care how gifted we may think that we are. I don't care how spectacular certain things may look like within the life of the church. Apart from a superior love for God and for others, we are nothing but clanging cymbals. What a sad reality. And so let me just ask you this question. Do you have a deep love for our triune God? Do you love His church? Do you love your neighbor? Because, loved ones, this is the more excellent way. This is the more excellent way. The more excellent way. So love is superior. The second thing that we see, though, how convenient it would be just to drop that and not describe it for us. And what Paul does, secondly, that we need to see is that Paul describes this love for us. And if you're like me, when I read this and we work through this, it should cause us to blush, right? So not only does Paul say that love is superior within the life of the church, but he describes to us what kind of love he's talking about. That Paul is explicit with his definition of love. Paul does not give way to a cultural definition of love, sentimentality, sort of this tolerance view that we have, but Paul drills down specifically, and now he has said to this church who's struggling, you have elevated certain gifts, you have taken things out of proportion, and you're in a dangerous situation because love is no longer superior among you. And now what he does as a good pastor and someone who loves the people is he says, let me describe to you in explicit terms what love should look like among you. Are you thankful for the details, like the schematic? How many of you men just love the schematic, right? So just give me the plans. Some of you are like, maybe you're independent, you don't like that, but I'm helped a lot by the schematic. And so what I want us to do is just revel over this list for just a moment and think about the explicit nature of this Christ-centered love that must, men and women, listen, it must flourish among God's people. Notice what he does. He begins to note in verse 4, you have positive and negative attributes, but he begins by saying love is patient and kind. Let's just read it all and we'll come back and pick them up. Love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. Love bears all things. It believes all things, hopes all things, it endures all things. And he says love never ends. And so as you see this catalog, he gets very specific. And I think it's important for us as we think about flourishing in Jesus and flourishing on mission together that we pray for this. But we need to understand it. And so notice what he says. First of all, he very clearly says that love is patient. It's long-suffering. In other words, you could say it this way. Love moves slowly and sensitively. It does not respond in haste. Now, how many of you are thankful on the other side maybe of marriage or friendship that someone has been long-suffering with you? That takes a good dose of reality, doesn't it? Because if you know anything about yourself, like I hope I'm learning, and I can be blind to I can be self-deceived. is I can be a very difficult person at times. And what Paul presses in on first and foremost that must be recaptured and understood within the life of the church is that patience, long-suffering is critical. That apart from having this type of view and practice, we are not loving. I don't care what you say in private. It is not there. Secondly, though, it's important he drills down further. Not only is love patient explicitly, but it's kind. I would say it this way, that the love of Christ in regards to this mark of kindness is that there should be a disposition of grace towards others. In other words, love is endearing and considerate of other people. I don't know how else to say it, but sometimes Christians are not kind people. They're not kind people. And men and women, this is an inconsistency. And I think it's hard to reconcile. I think it's extremely hard to reconcile. How is it that people can sit in earshot of the Word for years, come to congregation, whatever, for years, and be some of the most mean-spirited, unkind people in all the world? This is a huge inconsistency. And so one of the things that we see the love of Christ does is it creates kindness in our life. And Paul very explicitly says this. He goes on to say that we do not envy. Love does not envy. In other words, you could say it this way: you are not secretly jealous of others. Let me say that again. There is not this impulse that you become content in Christ. There's not this envious, either subtle or overt desire or jealousy that pops up often. Men and women, I think that this is one issue within the life of the church that many people today avoid. We remain surface in our discipleship, and we do not know how to kill jealousy in one another's lives. But he says that it is not part and parcel to love. He says it does not envy. He goes on to say it does not boast. You are careful to guard against self-promotion. You're careful to guard against self-promotion. Arrogance, you're not arrogant. It is not arrogant. Here's one for you. I think that it could be summarized this way, is that we don't give the impression of superiority. We don't give the impression of superiority. Men and women, this issue of boasting and this issue of arrogance is that pride must be killed among us. It must be killed among us. And then he goes on just quickly. He says, love is not rude. This, I think, flows back up into kindness, this disposition of grace. You actually treat people with respect and dignity. You treat people with respect and dignity. They are made in the image of God. And we treat people with respect and dignity. Sometimes I hold my tongue, but I've been in situations where people who profess Christ have been very rude to people. And I know there's a righteous indignation, and men and women, there are times that it just boils up in me because of rudeness. Men and women, on this issue, we do not assert our perceived rights like a bully. Men and women, we are measured by grace. Your tone and choice of words should be seasoned with grace. With grace. He goes on to say, Paul he doesn't leave any, there's no way out here, is there, right? He just keeps going. I'm like, Paul, could you stop at boasting? Can we just stop there? That's good enough. I already feel bad enough, right? But he just keeps going, all right? So hang on, all right? So he keeps going. He not only just says this, but here's one for you. He goes on to say, love does not insist on its own way. It does not insist on its own way. Do you realize that when we insist wrongly on wrong things, you could put it this way, that when we resist proper change in our own life or proper change in anything, do you realize, men and women, that that can be a loveless, selfish act? I've thought a lot about that when just thinking about marriage. Because when I think about my own life, when I resist, hear me, when I resist the change that I should make as a husband or as a dad, the proper change that I need to make in my own sanctification, as a husband or dad, do you realize that that in itself is a loveless act? It's a loveless act. It is an act of self-promotion and selfishness. It is treason. It's treason. But the church is plagued with this one today. Plagued. He goes on to say it is not irritable. As I was musing along over this one, here's sort of my paraphrase. You don't frustrate, right? You're not irritable. You're not resentful. Moving on, he says, you don't rejoice at wrongdoing, but you rejoice with truth. Notice what he says. He says in the text, it does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. Men and women, hear me. The impulse of love among God's people is to repel against that which is iniquity and sinful. And the impulse of God-centered, Christ-exalting love among God's people is that we resonate with the truth of God. It's important that we see this even in our culture. I think this is a big corrective. This attribute is a big corrective in our culture. That love is just not sentimental fluff. It is not just this tolerant view of things. Listen, the love of God's people always rejoices with the truth of God. And we always see anything that is evil and not truthful. There's this sense of frustration or even hatred, I would say, that should come. And then notice what he says in conclusion. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things, not out of the context of truthfulness. But let me just add what Paul is saying here. When you think about our love and your love and the love of Christ, men and women, love is resilient. It is resilient. The love of Christ has an enduring quality. That means that our love is not fickle. It's not superficial. Do you realize Friday, an hour, sitting with Matthew and Malachi, sad and rejoicing. Do you know why? Because what was being put on display was a love that was not fickle. They were rooting and concerned and wanting and desirous, and they understand not only the need for the word, but relationship. And it was hard struggle. A measure of resilience, a measure of strength that goes beyond the superficial. Men and women, love has an enduring quality. And let me just add, when you think about all of these marks of love, this is what's so huge and also so confusing, is that men and women, when you look at this catalog, we have to see the explicit nature of love is displayed and cultivated in community. Please don't miss this. Loved ones, hear me. The love that Paul is describing to this church is not a love in your private isolation. It's so important. This type of love that Paul is describing, he's actually exhorting the church to, has to be in his pursuit and context of relationships. Men and women, how can you learn to be patient with anyone if all you do is sit in front of sitcoms and soap operas your whole life? It will not happen. In your view of the depth and the mercies of God, as you move towards isolation, you will never experience the beauty of this. Paul is very explicit. Isolation and non-committal attitudes, men and women, damage love. It damages love. The reason that you may feel not loved, could be that you love your privacy and your isolation more than the public nature of which Paul is pushing love to. And men and women, let me add, the thought that I am marked by the love of Christ, which I may have in private reflection, is never satisfactory. Do you realize that that can be a self-deceiving concept or thought? Love is intentionally interpersonal. For gospel people, this means together under the word, in community, and on mission is always best. It is always best. How many of you are thankful that you have experienced a measure of God's love in community? How many? Yeah. It's amazing. In community, being vulnerable, right? Not withdrawing, but diving in. And you're like, what? This is so hard. Yeah, join the crowd. It's hard. This is difficult. But it's where God in His grace, in large measure, people, listen, it's in large measure where He meets us. And He pours out His blessing. Oh, loved one, I can't say it enough. This description of love is not in isolation. Although the flame of love is stoked in private contemplation of the gospel, it must be displayed in the congregation. Love in private is never a replacement for loving your brothers and sisters in public ways. It is never a replacement. This is what He's pressing for. You cannot display patience alone or learn to do this. You can't fight envy alone, pride alone. You cannot love others rightly if you don't love truth and reject error. The impulse of love in the church is never divorced or diminished by the knowledge and commitment to the truth. Love is best seen in the faith family when we are radically committed to pursuing someone else's well-being. Loved ones, the more I've dealt with this text, sometimes I stand back and I shudder and I'm like, there are measures of lovelessness that I have. And that I have not graduated. I wonder how many of us think that because we've been in church so long that we've got the market cornered on love. And how loveless we can be. So what must we do? Oh, what a daunting task. Right? What a picture. That love is superior in the life of the church. And love is described. That we cannot out of whole cloth define what we want love to be. And then Paul gives us the exhortation at the end. Basically, we must pursue love with unrelenting zeal. Look at verse 1. He says at the end, at the very beginning of 14, which flows obviously from 13, he says, so now faith, hope, and love abide at the end of 13. These three, but the greatest of these is love. There's the superiority. But then he gives the command. He says, pursue love and earnestly desire the spiritual gifts, especially that you may prophesy, which is a segue into next week. But here's the point. If you walk away and you think, okay, I shudder to think that I could be loveless, right? Paul's right. I've replaced things over this. I'm guilty. But then what does Paul tell us to do? He says, get after it. Do you realize that love is not cultivated and inflamed in our life by being lazy? Doesn't happen. Doesn't happen. That's why I would say that my prayer this week is not only that we would see the text, savor the text, but we would pursue the text with unrelenting zeal. This is important for us. That the love of Christ not only be sung about, not only be contemplated, but we must go after it. You will not become more loving if you are lazy. It will not happen. You have to put sweat to this. Spurgeon, I was so helped this week. I have not read Spurgeon's sermons like I used to. You'll remember before we had more kids, Saturday I would use a lot of Saturday time to read one of Spurgeon's sermons on the same topic. So this is what helped me this week, is just to pull out words of someone older than me, and dead, by the way, and to read his sermon on love to his people, preaching to thousands of people about this issue of love, about pursuing it. And so please hear me here at the end of what was said a couple of centuries ago. Here's what Spurgeon said about love. He said, but after it, love, is divinely born on our heart, it must be divinely nourished. Did you hear that? After love is born on our hearts, the power of God in the gospel, giving us the gift of Christ's love, it must be nourished. Spurgeon went on to say, love to God is a rich and rare thing. It would die if it were left to be frostbitten by the chilly blast of our selfishness, and if it received no nourishment. As love comes from heaven, so it must feed on heavenly bread. It cannot exist in this wilderness unless nurtured from above and fed by manna from on high. Men and women, we are called to go after love. as difficult as it is, as hard as it is, we are called to go after love. So what do we pursue? Men and women, I would just say there's a lot here I could say practically. But for the sake of time, I'm going to use Spurgeon. How do we do this? How do we fan the flame of our dead heart that can drift towards lovelessness? How can we kill the self-deception in our own life of where it's easy to say, I love you, but to know in our hearts we have drifted away from that truth? I would say we fan the flame of genuine love always on the gospel. Listen to what Spurgeon said, talking about how we must nourish love. A little lengthy, hang with me. Do you know that the only food that ever suits sick love is the food on which it fed at first? I have heard say by the physicians that if a man be sick, there is no place so well adapted for him as the place where he was born. And if love grows sick and cold, there is no place so fit for it to go to as the place where it was born, namely, the love of God in Christ Jesus our Lord. Where was love born? Was she born in the midst of romantic scenery? And was she nursed with wondrous contemplations upon the lap of beauty? Ah, no. Was she born on the steeps of Sinai, when God came from Sinai and the Holy One from Mount Paran and melted the mountains with the touch of his foot and made the rocks flow down like wax before his terrible presence? Oh, no, he says. Was love born on Tabor when the Savior was transfigured and his garment became whiter than wool, whiter than fuller could make it? Oh, no. Darkness rushed over the sight of those that looked upon him, and they fell asleep, for the glory overpowered them. Let me tell you where love was born. Love was born in the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus sweat drops of blood. It was nurtured in Pilate's hall, where Jesus bared his back to the plowing of the lash and gave his body to be spit upon and scourged. Love was nurtured at the cross. Amid the groans of an expiring God, beneath the droppings of his blood, it was there that love was nurtured. Bear me witness, children of God, where did your love spring from? But from the foot of the cross. Did you ever see the sweet flower growing anywhere but at the foot of Calvary? No. It was when you saw love divine, all loves excelling, outdoing its own self. It was when you saw love in bondage to itself, dying by its own stroke, laying down its life, though it had the power to retain it and to take it up again. It was there your love was born. And if you wish your love, when it is sick, to be recovered, take it to some of those sweet places. Make it sit in the shade of the olive trees, and make it stand on the pavement and gaze. While the blood is still gushing down, take it to the cross and bid it look and see afresh the bleeding lamb. And surely this shall make thy love spring from a dwarf into a giant. And this shall fan it from a spark into a flame. Men and women, when you and I think about how in the world is love sustained in a culture that seeks to kill it, it is only sustained and cultivated at Calvary. There is no other place. And so that's why we say to you who may be here today who is an unbeliever, who has rejected Christ covertly or overtly, the love of Christ on display at Calvary for sinners is the offer of divine love and satisfaction to you. And for the one who is here today who may have been in church for a long time, you know your thermometer of love is diminished. The counsel of the Word to us together is to fan the flame of love on the gospel of Jesus Christ. There is no magic 5-step process except to be struck in absolute awe that Jesus Christ died in your place. So how do we do this? We realize that the love of Christ is the sum of all virtue. And it is this love that disposes us to all good. May the love of Christ be superior among God's people once again.